Welcome to the CineReview, where I give you, lucky folks, my opinion on the current releases I've sat through at the cinema. This episode I have two films for you, and boy, they couldn't be much more different. Let's dive straight in with my first choice as we look at Drive. A Hollywood stunt driver spends his evening being a professional wheelman, driving criminals to and from their work, with an uncanny sense of professionalism. He's a man who eats, sleeps and breathes cars, though he barely ever sleeps. He meets his female neighbour, who he quickly becomes attached to, though he soon meets her husband, recently released from prison, who's got some hangovers from his jail days. Under threat from the people he owes money to, and with threats against his family, the driver offers to help him on one last job, which goes terribly wrong, leaving the driver with the price on his head. Drive has hit the screen to much critical praise, and it's certainly a rather remarkable film in many respects. Once again we find ourselves with a film that has a nameless central character. The driver, as he's known, is a very enigmatic character. He's almost mute, choosing only to speak when necessary, and he's a deeply accomplished driver. Driving is his life, his obsession, and he's the best at it. He's also intensely cool and calm. He appears unflappable and unemotional to a fault. From this introduction it would be easy to be indifferent about the character, but soon the character makes for a much more human character by virtue of his relationship with his neighbour, and here we begin to see that there is a deeply buried personality underneath all of this austere front. The characterization in Driver is very well handled. All the characters are fleshed out to a degree that you can actually give a crap about their fates one way or the other, and time is given to make sense of their behaviour, particularly that of the driver himself. The first half of the film is almost entirely building his character and giving him motivation for what will happen. This much care about the whats and whys for a character is something that is actually woefully rare these days. The film as a whole is very skillfully handled, from the retro-sounding soundtrack through to the stylized visual aesthetic, and the editing is incredible. The film carries an 18 rating, which is actually very rare these days, but it does actually really deserve it. The violence of this film is truly shocking. It hits hard, and it shakes the audience from complacency. Even to jaded eyes such as mine, the violent outbursts are just jarring so heavily, particularly because it seems to be in such opposition to the driver's nature in particular. It's very rare these days that I wince at a scene of brutality, but this film got me on every occasion. When having seen as much on-screen carnage as I have, it's always rather thrilling and breathtaking when I feel that shock that such a scene can and should deliver. It's like a punch to the gut, it's a visceral reaction, and that means there's some damn effective filmmaking that's going on here. Having such a long build-up, which this film really does, actually pays off, because when you get there, you care about the characters, and you understand them and their actions. For some, Drive may be very slow. This may well be the case, and they may want it all action, wall to wall, but I believe this is a perfect example of why characterization is so very important if you want your audience to invest themselves, not only in the people on screen, but to make them react when something good or terrible happens. The sound design of Drive bears some notice too. It's very skillfully handled. The scenes can sometimes be very starkly quiet, and then it's suddenly interrupted by a violent action. In some cases it almost borders on the jump scare, but it's never that crass. It just doesn't use the noise to make you jump. It accentuates the utter violence of what's going on, particularly in juxtaposition to the driver's apparent calm under normal circumstances. If there was any criticism, it would be that the music can sometimes get in the way a bit. It sometimes becomes too prominent once in a while. However, this said, it does create an almost hallucinatory sensation that sits nicely in the film. It's rare to see a film that can drag one in as much as Drive did. It's brutal, shocking, exciting, interesting, and of a quality that is way too uncommon these days. The wonderful thing about this film is that it isn't dominated by CG. It isn't all about the flashy motors, buff guys and fancy cars. It's not about a fantasy world of unrealistically nitro-enhanced supercars. It's all rather more mature than that. It's a solid and fascinating piece of cinematic excellence. Drive for me is highly recommended. Go catch it at the cinema if you can. And so on to my second film of the day, and it was a film I was kinda looking forward to. And boy was I mistaken. 30 minutes or less follows the story of Nick, a pizza delivery man with little ambition or prospects. When a couple of gold-digging lowlifes plan to bump off the rich old bastard that is one of the guy's dad, they need to raise some money to hire the killer. Being too lazy to do the job themselves, they kidnap Nick, strap a remote control bomb to him, and send him out to do their dirty work. I actually had modest expectations of this film. I thought I was going to be in for some light comedy that may pass the day in an undemanding and moderately amusing fashion. No such luck. 30 minutes or less seems to manage to trip up at just about every step. Firstly, the acting in this film seems to be lacking quite significantly, and I'm aware of the fact that this was never likely to be Oscar material, but I couldn't shake the feeling that not one performance in this film seemed to contain any enthusiasm for the project. It all feels very, very forced. It's as if they were trying to get this one in the can and fuck off to do the week's grocery shopping. I couldn't help but feel that the direction of the actors was just so non-committal, because the delivery of the lines, particularly the ones that should have been particularly funny, either came off as being that the actors were reading them entirely out of context, or that they were struggling to keep in character. Then there's the tone of the film that bounces around like nobody's business. I like darkness in comedy, but the dark humour in 30 minutes seems decidedly mean-spirited or in incredibly bad taste. For instance, there's a scene where Nick and Chet go to buy fake guns and disguises, and the cashier makes several supposedly funny comments about them preparing to go out and rape someone. I'm sorry, but that isn't exactly laugh out loud or indeed crafty snigger material. This is a film that's full of deeply dodgy humour of this kind, where it's just a little too close to the line of being deeply unpleasant in tone. It's like spending 83 minutes in the company of that guy in the pub that makes the racist jokes that are not entirely spiteful, but are nonetheless deeply uncomfortable. The bad guys in this are particularly bad for this kind of behaviour. I mean, are we supposed to hate them, or are they a comic foil? They frankly just become uncomfortable company, and the jokes that they make constantly border on being upsettingly inappropriate. And this is the film in a nutshell. It has some occasionally funny moments, but overall is surprisingly mean-spirited and unpleasant. I'm no prude when it comes to political correctness, but humour of this kind, it takes great skill to pull it off, and the writing and performances here are just not strong, skilled or savvy enough to pull it off. And the result is a film that may provoke some almost apologetic laughter, and the occasional genuine titter, but little more than that. And the sad truth is that it seems to leave a bit of a bad taste in the mouth. It's painfully crass on many occasions. It simply doesn't know what kind of tone it wants to play at, dark or light, edgy or crass, and as a result it fails at all of them because it flits around and it sends all the wrong signals out. It's a strange thing, but the trailer was actually better directed than the film itself. The film itself is just so unfocused that it effectively kills the entire movie. This is the closest I've ever come to walking out of a film. By 15 minutes in, I knew this was all going wrong, and I had been very optimistic at the beginning. I could barely stand to see how bad this could get. Though it's not the worst thing out there, I cannot recommend 30 minutes or less. It could have been half decent, instead it ended up being a real mess. 30 minutes or less is not recommended.